The interesting thing about these men is that they're modernists or neo-modernists. They're from that line, and like if you read Pascendi by Pope St. Pius X against the modernists, he talks about how kind of devious they are and how they stay within the church and they try to change it from within. And sometimes they put on a kind of facade so you can't really tell all the time that they're modernists.
Here we go. Welcome to a special edition of the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. We call these special editions The Way is Love. Find The Focusing Way on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our website, thefocusingway.com. There is a somewhat obscure 8th century Irish Catholic saint named Saint Gall, who during the course of his life founded an abbey and monastery in Switzerland, in a town now called Saint Gallen, which today is a Unesco World Heritage Site. Near the end of his life, a bear became Saint Gall's only friend. The bear, it is said, brought him wood for his fire. To this day, the abbey still stands in the town of Saint Gallen, Switzerland. The image of a bear is on its coat of arms. Saint Gallen Mafia, exposing the secret reformist group within the church, is the title of an intriguing, challenging, and thought-provoking book by Julia Meloni. She meticulously pieces together documented events and writings surrounding power struggles within the Roman Catholic Church leading up to and after the death of Saint Pope John Paul II. For non-Catholics, it reads like a factual thriller, and for the Catholic, the book could feel more dire and be seen as the beginnings of the complete takedown of 2,000 years of Catholic tradition. And joining me to talk about her book, Saint Gallen Mafia, is author Julia Meloni. Julia, welcome to The Way is Love on the Focusing Way podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, as I read your book, there are pages and pages of cited public sources in the footnotes on every page of this book. So could you just start by talking about your research and your sources in putting this book together?
Yeah, so this group, this high-ranking group of churchmen that was meeting in Saint Gall, Switzerland, they could have kept their meetings very secret, but instead, I found that they, at a certain point, they wanted to divulge the details of the fact that they had been meeting and they had an agenda to revolutionize the church. So when I started this research process, it was a couple years after Cardinal Godfrey de Niels had boasted that he had been in this mafia, and his authorized biography had been released. And it gave a number of details about the group, but there were a number of kind of other sources that you could go to find further details. I looked a lot at the writings of the group leader, the longtime leader, Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini, because he doesn't. There were interesting things because in his own writings, he talked about his agenda for the church and basically in order, like what he wanted to do for the church. It mapped onto a lot of the things that the de Niels biography said they were talking about in Saint Gall, Switzerland. So it was kind of a roundabout, disguised way that he was confessing what they were doing in the group. But also there were sources like Martini had a priest secretary who helped him towards the end of his life. Mm-hmm. And the priest secretary wrote a book and talked about the last kind of years of his life. And he talks about like this, very casually, he talks about this meeting that they had in April of 2012, I believe. And you can go to other sources and find similar corroborations about this meeting and other things they were doing. So basically, it was kind of scouring a lot of resources in different languages by respected Vatican experts, and then the writings of the mafia members themselves.
Now, for our listeners, I'm just going to read the definition of the word mafia. And so it's an organized international body of criminals operating originally in Sicily and now especially in Italy and the US, and having a complex and ruthless behavioral code, or any organized group of criminals resembling the mafia in its way of operating, or a group regarded as exerting a hidden, sinister influence. Now, let's just be clear. The title of your book, Saint Gallen Mafia, was not a clickbait title that you created. Saint or Sankt Gallen is Mafia, is the name they assigned to themselves. Is that correct?
Exactly. So when Daniels in 2015 gave that interview where he talked about this group, he said something like the Saint Gallen group is a kind of posh name, but we called ourselves the Mafia. So it became the Saint Gallen Mafia because of precisely what he said. And again, there's this kind of hubris. There's this kind of, again, like the fact that he needed to boast about it. And this was a group that was against Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. And, you know, he was boasting while Ratzinger's still living. And he's boasting just a couple of years into the Pope Francis pontificate, very close to the beginning of the Second Synod on the Family that was very contentious. So he after all these years of being underground, you can just tell they want to claim credit. They want to come out of the shadows, at least those who are living.
So there is a lot to unpack in the book, and the effects that this group of people, some of whom you've already named, have had on the papacy, and in giving it a definitive and a modern agenda. But it's really important for our listeners to understand these main characters. And of course, the two main characters are the two living popes, Pope Benedict and Emeritus, and the 16th, and Pope Francis. But there are four cardinals, some of whom you've already named. Can you just give me a very quick, these four characters, Martini, Casper, Silvestrini, and Daniels? Because they're going to be names that we're hearing over the course of this conversation. And I just wanted you to give our listeners a small overview of who these characters in your book are.
Yeah. So as I alluded to earlier, the longtime leader was Martini. And Martini was he was born the same year as Ratzinger. He was a brilliant biblical scholar, and then John Paul II wanted him to be the Archbishop of Milan. And Martini was very hesitant, but he took the post, and then started kind of connecting with different other characters that I'll talk about later. Daniels. Daniels is kind of the main one that he connects with during the 80s. And then around the 90s, Martini emerges as kind of the media favorite for becoming the next pope. There's even this big feature article in the 1993 London Sunday Times that asks whether Martini is the next pope. Wow. And basically it was, the idea was maybe the pendulum would swing after the long conservative papacy of John Paul II, maybe it would swing to the other side and you could have a progressive like Martini, or at least that's what the media hoped for. But the issue is Martini, he gets Parkinson's disease, and he doesn't reveal the diagnosis until 2002, but he had been suffering for a while, quietly. And so he couldn't really become the next pope by the time of the 2005 conclave. So when he founds the group, the Saint Gallen Mafia, in 1996, and one of the so another person who's important to that founding core group of members is Walter Casper, now Cardinal Walter Casper. And a lot of people might know him from the synods on the family during the Pope Francis pontificate. Basically, Casper, the main thing he is known for is the Casper proposal for communion for the divorced and civilly remarried without an annulment. And Casper, this was something he had been agitating for since like the 1970s. And it sounds like it was very important to the St. Gallen group. In 1993, Casper tried to get his proposal to work locally in Germany, and then Ratzinger shut it down. So this Casper proposal was kind of at the heart of, kind of what the St. Gallen Mafia wanted to start with once they got a like-minded pope in office. The two other ones you mentioned, Achilles Silvestrini was an Italian diplomat, and he replaced Martini when Martini became too sick around 2003 or so. Martini was too sick. Martini would still go to certain meetings, but he couldn't really head the group anymore. And Silvestrini was obsessed with the succession of Pope John Paul II. He had been very close to John Paul II. He was one of the last people who saw him before he died. And he appears to be the one who really identified then Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio as being a great candidate for the next pope. So that's Silvestrini's role. And then Daniels, as we mentioned before, he's basically the reason we know about the group. And he was a Belgian cardinal, and he was an expert on the liturgy, very kind of cerebral, but also very progressive, kind of presiding over the collapse of the church in Belgium. And then he was disgraced around 2010 because he had been caught on tape covering up, trying to keep an abuse victim quiet, and trying to cover it up and trying to make the abuse victim go away, and telling him he needed to feel sorry for his role in his own abuse. And it was just a lot of very sad things going on there. So there is there's a revolutionary aspect and agenda to this group, but with someone like Daniels, there's also a very kind of dark cover up of sexual abuse aspect as well.
Yeah, and I'm just going to read a little bit from the book here where I'll just quoting the mafia's modus operandi, according to Daniel's biography, was to plot privately at first and then follow up with public incremental action. And by 2000, according to one of Daniel's biographers, the mafia was thinking more strategically about what was going to happen to the church after John Paul II. Talk to me about what it means to be using these kind of terms when it comes to the church founded by Christ.
Yeah. So these men are really, you could call them modernists or neo-modernists. They wanted to see the church fluctuate according to the waters of history. They wanted some people like Casper. Casper is this scholar who is really kind of theorized this quite a bit. And some of his writings, especially some of his early writings as a priest, are kind of startling. There's this part in the book that I quote where basically he says that a God who is not, a God who sits above history, a God who is not history itself, is like this enemy of the new and a wretched idol, and just, I mean, this really very, very kind of overblown rhetoric to describe it. So they wanted the church to get up to date, and Martini, he gave a last interview in 2012, and he said the church is 200 years behind. And other people, including historian Roberto De Mattei, have talked about how that figure, that number, brings us roughly to the time of the French Revolution. And it's this idea that the church needed to have her own French Revolution. But the interesting thing about these men is they, again, they're modernists or neo-modernists. They're from that line. And one of the like, if you read Pascendi by Pope St. Pius X against the modernists, he talks about how kind of devious they are, and how they stay within the church and they try to change it from within. And sometimes they put on a kind of facade so you can't really tell all the time that they're modernists. So these men, this is where the word incremental comes from that passage. These men, they might say something conservative or good at one moment, and then they'll follow up with something progressive and revolutionary. They might push a proposal and then back off for a while, like maybe even years, and then go right back into pushing the proposal again.
Yeah.
So this aspect of doing things in stealth and with time and slowly and patiently, I think that's kind of like one of the main ideas of the book.
Yeah, and the book, as you're reading it, I realized it sort of uncovers this tactical nature of information and the means by which information is put into the public sphere. It's kind of like put out there and it's left to simmer, and then it's it seems to serve two purposes, to get a gauge of how it might be received, what's the temperature of things, but also to possibly also communicate to other people in the know or other people who are thinking, or also, we've heard the term predictive programming, to sort of tell people what thinking is going on for future events. And there's this timeline to events, but early on there's this anonymous letter leaked, Confession d'un cardinal, or a cardinal's confession. So can you just talk about how was this present church agenda, how it was sort of publicized and promoted while remaining completely anonymous through this letter?
Yeah. So that was kind of that was one of the most interesting things in the book for me, because I thought I knew that, again, I knew Martini would be a center of gravity, but I didn't really know very much about Silvestrini. And Silvestrini, this is an interview, Confession of a Cardinal, the English translation title. This is an interview of a high-ranking cardinal, and we don't know his identity, but we get little sprinklings of of information about details about who he was, and you can kind of piece together. Basically, Nicolas Diat, the author, the French author, of a different book on Pope Benedict and his pontificate. Diat says a number of people have looked at this Confession of a Cardinal and seen the fingerprints of Silvestrini, and a number of people think this is the thinly veiled confession of Silvestrini. I started reading the book, and at a certain point, kind of early on, I said, I think this is Silvestrini, because this person at some point talks about how he says that he is friends with Martini and he's friends with Casper. And then he talks about some of the projects that Martini, Casper, and Daniels are doing. And so you think immediately, you start thinking, this person is either in the mafia or has been to the meetings before or is an ally of the mafia, it sounds like, because this specific circle of people, this is the mafia circle. And then I kind of go through in the book a couple of different details that kind of make me think that it's really Silvestrini. But whether it's Silvestrini or not, this fact that this person this book was published in 2007, and the interviews, it says the interviews took place in 2005, shortly after Benedict was elected. So in 2007, it's circulating basically that there are high-ranking men like Martini, Casper, and Daniels who have an agenda that is not Benedict's agenda. Mm-hmm. And so this is an attempt to undermine Benedict, one of many attempts to undermine Benedict. And the fact that, one of the most interesting parts of the book is they talk about Cardinal Bergoglio in the book, and they talk about how he says, I and some other people, we were talking about having a cardinal who kind of could bridge Europe and Latin America. And then he says, and we thought of Cardinal Bergoglio. And again, this was the fact that this was published in 2007 after Benedict had been elected. And they're talking about Bergoglio, and they say basically, we need to keep in mind Bergoglio's performance just in case Benedict's pontificate does not last long. It just, to me, it's absolutely jaw-dropping.
Yeah. Yeah. And, when we're talking about God's will, and I think about how as I'm reading the book, I think, and I'm wondering what you think of this, but how do you reconcile sort of God's will in allowing all of this to happen? What's gone on in the most recent papacies, and how you've now come to see how they came to be?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think that even before this pontificate, I've always been just very interested in things like the Fatima message, and just the idea of that when heaven came, the message was penance, and certainly at Lourdes, penance was a message as well. And this idea that we need to voluntarily purify ourselves, and in doing so purify the church, or there might be some external event by the finger of God that has to purify it for us. And things have gotten, it's certainly very difficult wading through this material and seeing the plots. And when I researched this book, For instance, we just talked about Confession of a Cardinal. I didn't realize until I researched the book how much opposition there had been to Benedict and to his program for renewing the church. I knew there had been opposition, but I didn't realize the depths of it and everything. So I think that reading these kinds of things, I go back to the idea of Fatima and just conversion, and we have to. We can do. People can say, why do I want to know what's going on in the church or whatever? To me, knowing what's going on in the church can help us try to do extra, forms of reparation and conversion in our own lives, and that can absolutely help the church. I mean, the sanctity of each one of us can absolutely do something to we don't have any other, that's kind of the only hope we have, it appears right now, is listening to the message of personal conversion in places like Fatima.
Yeah, and just as a side note, we know that Pope Benedict read the Third Secret during Pope John Paul's pontificate. So he had read that document as a theologian. I'm sure he understood it very completely. And we still, Fatima's a whole other conversation. Stay tuned for part 2. You've been listening to author Julia Meloni. Her book, Saint Gallen Mafia, Exposing the Secret Reformist Group Within the Church. Check us out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, our website, thefocusingway.com.